So the first thing I'd like to do is just to thank you both for sharing those stories with us, but also just to reflect on each other's stories as a way to bring everyone into the conversation. Sheryl, I'll let you go first. Give the other Sheryl a little rest, because she just finished talking.
Well, as I was telling Cheryl, I teach the doctrine of discovery, and I teach a class called Race and American Law, and I teach a unit on the legal history of Native Americans. But, you know, we cover all of the major demographic groups in parallel, but this story about Native Americans really helps to help students of all colors understand that, you know, America is this project of, you know, we're transitioning from an America where, you know, your description of Dr. Discovery is very apt. It's brutal, it's painful, but most people don't receive American history that way. You know, we sort of whitewash, pardon the pun, but you know, we you know, but we're on this project of coming to terms with a history that is not pretty, and in the 21st century, coming to terms with creating institutions that honor all the different strains that are America, and creating institutions that have voice, that give voice to people who feel voiceless and invisible. So I just want to thank you so much for a very powerful presentation.
Thank you.
Cheryl, did you want to?
I actually still have my mic on. I wanted to thank you because I truly believe that for each of us, our primary motivation is our hopefulness for the future. And what I heard from the story that you shared is something that really resonated with me. We're invisible, and the brutality that American Indians currently experience is much like the brutality that African American experience and other people of color have in this country. And so it's a shared journey that we have to be on. But I also, from an education perspective, you know, what really resonated for me is that your family has a story with education. And I think many of our families do have that story, and we can make it a positive experience for people who are coming after us.
Thank you both. One observation that I would make before opening it up, and I don't think this is a Q&A, this is a conversation, we're just inviting you into it. The other two speakers who weren't able to make it today were both going to talk on technology issues. And as I was listening to the two stories, I was reminded, Michael Dertouzos was the founding director of the MIT Media Lab. And he always was a humanist at his core. And one of his arguments with all of the technology triumphalism conversations that happen, especially in education, was, look, technology is only useful as long as it addresses basic human needs first. And as I'm struck by the creative tension between equity issues, and when we start talking about innovation and technology in higher education, how far we still need to go to address some of the basic issues in society and culture to do that. So I'd like to invite anyone, and what we'll do is, we do have, Jennifer will bring a microphone to you if you raise your hand. So please, anyone, just enter into our conversation. We welcome you. You can raise your hand. They're really nice, I promise. Oh, there you go. And please just say your name, and don't have to say where you're from, just so we know who you are.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, good. My name is Linda, and what struck me so much when you were speaking, Cheryl, about your sons, is that I have two nephews who are brown, and they've experienced similar types of situations. One is now in college, and another will hopefully enter college in a couple of years. And the one nephew was at a party, and he was the one stopped by the police, and the others were not. And it just makes my soul cry. It really does, to hear this. And when they were young, I was oblivious to all this. But now that they're older, I'm not. And then to hear the story of the Native Americans, it just makes me feel so sad. But thank you so much for sharing.
Can I ask one question of both of you? There's so much, and I think when Cheryl Crazy Bull, I can't say Sheryl because they're both named Cheryl. So Cheryl. Cheryl, I remember when I spoke with Cheryl Crazy Bull preparing for this, we talked a lot about the amount of pain and tragedy that there is in the story. And can I ask you both, especially with Linda's comment, thank you, just talk about, and you talked about it a little bit in your comment, Cheryl Cashin, how you turn that into action and to advocate and to champion for change. Can you just talk about that a little bit and reflect on that? Cheryl Crazy Bull first, and then Cheryl Cashin.
Yeah, I think that that's a very interesting question. Last year I gave a talk at the National Conference on Race and Equity in Education, and I think it was one of the best talks I ever gave. And it felt so on point, and I felt so present. And I realized afterwards that suddenly I was going to be viewed as an expert on race and equity in education. And I do not think that is my responsibility. So I think every individual who is in a situation where they have influence over what's taught in the classroom, over whether or not adequate resources are provided to Native students when they come to your institution, over whether or not there are partnerships with your tribes that are located near you, or even if you're in an urban area with Native Indian centers. I think that that's the responsibility of individuals. You can make a difference just by naming the experience that's occurring and looking at what kinds of policies and practices. I read a wonderful article after the incident at the University of Oklahoma with the fraternity, where someone said we're very good at recognizing races, but we're not very good at dealing with racism. And so I think that that's the responsibility, though, of people with the privilege of that.
So the silver lining for me, in this issue of racial profiling of unarmed black men has obviously been in the news a lot, right? And as ugly and as painful as this story is, the silver lining in it, all of it for me, is to see often with these protesters that, and this is what I would tell my sons as they older, they have allies today that my father didn't have when he got clubbed in the head, right? And that there is a growing class of what I call culturally dexterous whites who live diversity. They'll have diversity in their own families, but live it, want it for their kids, like it. They may be befuddled about how to make it work and successful, but this is the positive story. But as ugly as this history is, particularly for your people, in every generation there were people. I often like to give the example of the radical Republicans. There were people who were fighting for a different narrative, one of inclusion and universal human dignity. And so that's my message. And again, this is what I love about what you're saying. It's not the victims of incidents' responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility to build these coalitions for fairer and better practices. And we all, we're doing it at Georgetown Law. I mean, it is a struggle. Every year we deal with issues of classroom crime and how certain groups feel invisible. How do we create these institutions where everybody feels valued and we truly are building things that help all people learn and all people be included and nobody be treated differently just because of a status over which they have no control?
Can I say something about mascots? I'd like to say something about mascots, particularly being here in Washington, where the Washington team has a mascot name that American Indian, Alaska Native people have pretty much universally opposed, along with many other allies, churches, civil rights groups, others. Recently, there has been some declaration that that's somehow freedom of speech. If you look back at the history of the development of that word, there are actually accounts that you could be paid as a hunter of red skins for the skins that you brought in of red people. So this word is not a noble descriptor of American Indians. It's a term that was actually used, you know, in flyers and publications where you could get $25 if you brought in a redskin. So, you know, I think that mascots, many people think that it doesn't matter, but it truly does, because it creates caricatures of people who, you know, are still here. And those words can be quite painful to us. So I think that if you want to make a difference, you can oppose mascot names.
Anyone else like to join our conversation? Just please raise your hand, and Jennifer will bring you a mic. Matt, right here. Jennifer, right there.
Thanks. Matt Gartner. And I had a question for Sheryl Cashin, actually. So I know that you started writing Place Not Race prior to 2014. And in 2014, as you mentioned, there were from Eric Garner to Michael Brown and Ferguson, a lot of events dealing with racial profiling. And I'm wondering if those have made you rethink at all, or if you had any feedback from people about whether the appropriate framework for defining and operationalizing disadvantage is place and race versus place not race.
So if you look at the story behind a lot of these incidents, particularly Ferguson, segregation is a huge part of the story, right? And part of the reason why I argue for place, not race, is that race, particularly at very, very selective schools, and I see it in my own institution, is having some unintended consequence. The primary beneficiaries, because of the nefarious influence of U.S. News and World Report, right, that overemphasizes, you know, standardized test scores. You know, every institution is worried about maintaining or rising, and standardized test scores is part of, you know, their median. They don't want to sacrifice their median SAT. But everybody wants at least a modicum of phenotypical diversity. So it's much easier to get diversity, optical diversity, without sacrificing your median SAT scores by, you know, tapping the most advantaged people with dark skin. And in some ways, ironically, race makes you a little bit lazy, right? But meanwhile, and you know, I talk about this, it's not exactly comfortable, but increasingly, and I see this in my own school, black students increasingly are women from West Africa who don't come from out of this tradition of American apartheid, you know. But that said, and I've made this very clear in defending myself from critics, I'm not arguing for color blindness in all situations, right? And I'm an arch advocate for being race conscious to counter racism, right? You know, and racial profiling is a form of racism, right? And I also argue that in admissions, people should be given the option or encouraged to talk about the things that they have had to overcome. And absolutely, if you are a student who's had to overcome and negotiates violence and predatory policing, that should be your part of your story. And you've had to exercise a lot of grit to deal with that on a daily basis and still rise and be a high-achieving person. I hope that's responsive.
Cheryl, did you want to make any observations? No? Anyone else? Oh, we're right over here.
Well, thank you both. I'll see if I can make sense of this because you've given me lots to think about. One of the things that strikes me is both of you talking about place-based education and how important that context is. And coming from Texas, where our admissions laws are based on the fact of racial placing, essentially, it really resonates with me today. But what I really wanted to talk about was the doctrine of diversity that you talked about, Sheryl Crazy Bull. And I have a colleague who talks about education in this time and place as struggling, and part of our conversation with the public, struggling that because we have changed from being a frontier mentality and being very open compared to European education to now being empire. And that we're now not the way that you get better from wherever you started and however you started, but we are doing just exactly what you said, Cheryl Cashin, advantaging the already advantaged. But it was interesting to me when I was thinking about the doctrine of discovery and the idea, as my colleague puts it, of being a frontier educational system as positive. It's much more complex than all of that. And so I don't really have a question, and I don't obviously have a coherent comment because there's a lot going on in my mind that I'm going to have to do some thinking about. But those things really struck me, is that doctrine of discovery, that concept of education being frontier on discovery in our educational and research and those kinds of things, and our learning about ourselves and each other, but also about the negative piece of discovery, and that transition into empire as education, when the frontier school used to be much more accessible to people, and now education is not seen as accessible to and a way to move forward. So I guess what I'm doing is sharing these multitude of thoughts that the two of you have risen in me, and I'm saying thank you for that, and I've got to go obviously work on figuring that out, but thank you.
Did either of you, one of you want to comment?
Yeah, I don't think there's such a thing as finding that place where it will all be perfect. As I've gotten older, I've come to realize that trying to find that place is the work. That finding that place is hard to do, but looking for it is the work.
Any other questions? Oh, we've got one over here, Jennifer.
First of all, I also would like to thank both of you for tremendous stories, and I'm a big believer in storytelling and the impact that that has, so thank you so much. Sheryl Cashin, your history and background resonates with me very closely because I grew up in Tuscumbia, Alabama, which is only about 20 miles from Decatur, Alabama, that you referenced. One of the issues that we face today in seeking equity, equality, trying to reconcile wrongs that we see, or this conflict, particularly at faith-based institutions, as was mentioned, the conflict between what's legal and what would be a moral situation, that we know we should be treating individuals in a certain way. And I pose that question to another great Alabamian, Sheryl, that you may know, named Fred Gray. And Fred, who is an African-American lawyer, very successful, first state representative of the African-American race elected to the state legislature in Alabama.
After Reconstruction.
After Reconstruction, that's correct, after Reconstruction. Fred stated in a class that I was in at one time, sharing with him, you never break the law in order to change the law. And he made that statement in 1972 when I was in graduate school at Auburn, Alabama, in the midst of protests, and shortly after Selma, Alabama, and all of these. And I said, Fred, you were a lawyer for Martin Luther King. You represented Rosa Parks. You were a civil rights leader all the way. How can you say that? Martin Luther King writes letters from a Birmingham jail in which he says, I answer to a higher law. How do you say that? He said, I never advised Martin to break the law, but once he did, then he was in my ring and I would defend him. How would you deal with, you have two sons that are coming along who obviously search for change to bring about a greater equality that is morally, in my view, my own opinion, correct, that we should be treating people equally. And yet we see today a violent protest that occurs frequently in disparity situations across the country. What advice would you give all of us in working through that dilemma and all of the factors that come into play? I appreciated so much you said you're going to have to find your allies and you're going to have to build multiracial coalitions. But when it's so suppressive legally, as it was in the 60s and in the 50s, what advice would you give all of us today in leading toward a better goal?
So on your first question about, I disagree with Fred Gray about, I think it was absolutely legitimate for nonviolent protesters in Alabama to break immoral Jim Crow laws. And my parents in the sit-in movement in Huntsville, they would do this. Sometimes they would just break a law by going to a park that was segregated and say, we're desegregating today, right? But, the moral clarity came from nonviolence. I will take issue with your description of the, post-Ferguson protests. Some of them have been violent, but I think the vast majority of people who protested have been nonviolent. There have been some violent actors, and I think, we don't know yet who shot those policemen, but, most people who participated in the Ferguson protests would say that's wrong and they wouldn't advocate that. So it's the difference between nonviolence and violence. But I will say, as a tactical matter, and King was nothing if not a tactician, right? As a tactical matter, if you want to create a transformative politics that gets you, that wins over, majority opinion, that gets you transformative change, particularly in a legislature, your tactics need to have moral authority, and sometimes the law is immoral. So I will just leave it at that. But that's part of the logic, and in my last chapter of my book, Place Not Race, which I understand is for sale somewhere in the building. Shameless, right? But the last chapter is called Reconciliation, and I talk about this, the difference between, strategies that are potentially transformative and those that are not.
Cheryl, Crazy Bull, did you want to mention anything in terms of movements in, like, the American Indian movement and nonviolent protests versus violence and things like that?
I think one of the characteristics of tribal communities that many people forget is that they're extremely impoverished. So oftentimes basic human needs are not being met, and there tends to be a lot of lateral violence in those kinds of environments. But when I think about rights, one thing that I would like to mention, which I think is important to this discussion, is that if we want change, we need to address the voting rights issues that are going on right now. It is happening in South Dakota, where I'm from, where people can't get to polling places. They're not accepting tribal IDs as identification. I know that's happening all across the country in order to silence people of color. So when I think of things like addressing unjust laws, I think there's a good one that we could all work on.
Anyone else that would like to join our conversation? Right there, just up in the back, Jennifer.
Hi, my name's Bola. Thank you both. My question, hopefully it doesn't ramble, is for Sheryl Cashin. was trying to think about the title of your book, and I haven't read it, so I'm glad it's on sale. The title of your book, and then also, because you mentioned that you tried to get it published a few times, and you know, there was some nervousness about the critique of what some civil rights or some, you know, black folks or people of color might think about your argument. And I was trying to think about what else could your book be called, and so I was thinking, don't just admit rich people of color to your universities. Could be maybe be a title. But I was hoping that you could maybe talk about some of the conversations or critiques from civil rights activists, as you mentioned, or just other folks that were maybe nervous about what message this might send, or what fuel this might give to people who already don't want to admit people of color to universities and colleges.
Okay, so first the title, and this gets to Matthew's question. You know, if you read the book, you may come away saying, well, really the title should be Place is Race, right? Because it really is, right? Segregation is heavily racialized, but you know, my bottom line is that not all Black and Latino kids are disadvantaged. Some are very, very disadvantaged, and not all white and Asian kids are privileged, but place accurately reflects the legacy of Jim Crow segregation in this country, right? And overwhelmingly, children of color suffer it, right? And affirmative action as practiced today in selective schools doesn't really do much to help Black and Latino kids who are stuck in separate and unequal schools, right? And so, but you know, when it comes to titles, this is a trade book. If you want people to read, you know, you need catchy titles, and you know, that's about getting people to pick up the book and engage with it. Now, in terms of, but if you read the book, it's clear. I'm not Clarence Thomas. I'm not, actually more to the point, I'm not Ward Connerly, right? I am not advocating colorblindness. And what I've said to critics of the book, who, you know, one critic just savaged me in the American Prospect, saying that I was abandoning the Black middle class. And I said, you know, actually, au contraire, it's African Americans who most suffer this scourge of segregation. There's a stat in Ta-Nehisi Coates. You know, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote this cover piece for The Atlantic about reparations, and if you read it, it's all about segregation, but there's a line in there where he cites this book, Stuck in Place. It says, African Americans making $100,000 a year tend to live in neighborhoods that have the kinds of amenities that whites living in, who make $30,000 a year live in, right? So, you know, maybe I shouldn't say this on camera, but there's a method to my madness, right? Meanwhile, you know, race-based affirmative action is under legal assault and political assault. It's actually a declining policy because of the recent Supreme Court cases. But if 100 years from now, you still have separate and unequal schools in very segregated neighborhoods, the legal and ethical, moral, political case for place-based affirmative action will be there.
I wanted to start winding things up with the group, and just a few observations. First, I will add to Sheryl's shameless plug. and her book will be on sale in the exhibition hall after the opening plenary, which is a little bit later on this afternoon. One thing, I want to just thank both of our storytellers today for their courage. You know, they unpacked for us very personal stories about very big issues that impact society and higher education. And it's interesting because the room is very quiet. And clearly we're all thinking. We each have our own stories that go along with the stories they unpacked for us here. Not because we've lived the same ones, but they're asking big questions. They're asking us moral questions that we'll all be here thinking about. And all that I would ask each and every one of you is that as you leave here, leave feeling that we've raised some really, really hard but important questions for you to take with you, that we started in this conversation. Take it to your work. I'm a policy researcher. I take it to my work when I take it to work. And lastly, thank you all for your courage for staying in a conversation with us. So, and then finally, because I think we really, 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 really need to thank Langston and Logan for sitting here so quietly for almost an hour and 15 minutes. Thank you all. This was the first Ideas Forum at the ACE annual meeting, and you helped make it all a great success. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Louis. Thank you, Cheryl.